Chair Trivette?
Here.
Mr. Fuller?
Here.
Mr. Carnifex?
Here.
All right, our first item on the agenda is approval of the minutes. I think everybody's had access to those. Are there any additions, deletions, or corrections?
Motion to approve?
Second. Ms. Hutton?
Aye.
Mr. Morgan?
Aye.
Chair Trivette?
Aye.
Mr. Fuller?
Abstain.
Mr. Carnifex?
Yay. Approve.
Are there any board member announcements? Okay. Under reports, Ms. Dameron, financials.
Yes, this month I have an update to the June for expenditures that were recognized or paid in July for services rendered. So that changed or reduced our fund balance by $17,602.63. The majority of those charges were expenditures for the sports complex. And then in July, we have received $30,430 in interest income.
Does anybody have any questions for Ms. Dameron? Thank you, Barbara. Legal.
Mr. Chairman, I really don't have any real report unless the questions I'll be glad to answer.
All right. Any questions of legal? Okay. That brings us to open forum. If anybody in the audience would like to come up and address the board, you can step to the microphone, say your name and address. Seeing none, we'll move on. We don't have any public hearings. We'll go straight to new business. We've got an update from Victus Advisors on the RFP. I think it was really an RFI for operators. Mr. Connolly.
How are you doing this afternoon?
Doing well.
So, am I able to share my screen? I just put a quick slide together.
I think so.
All right, let me try here. All right, can you see that?
Sort of.
Sort of.
Yeah.
So, we received 4 responses to the RFI. The 4 groups were all operating entities, so it was Centers, Kemper Sports, Sports Facilities Companies, and Eastern Sports Management. I will say, out of the 4 responses, 3 of the 4 really just focused on the operations piece and either ignored the marketing only piece or said that they were not interested in the marketing only piece. The only one of the 4 that offered a separate proposal and estimate for the marketing piece was Kemper Sports. Our intention was to invite all 4 of them to come interview. Travis and I worked with Dusty, and it looks like we're going to be focused on the morning of Monday, August 28th for those interviews, and we're planning to allocate an hour each for those. So one of the questions I had for this group is, how would you like them to focus their use of that time? I mean, my recommendation would be we ask them to focus on their operations and marketing plan and detail what makes them unique in that way, rather than spending too much time on the qualifications. And just so you know, I'll also be sending the board a sort of summary breakdown of the proposals on a matrix stacked up against each other that'll make it easier to process some of that information. But my thought would be, 30 minutes for them to present their operations and marketing plan mostly, and then maybe 30 minutes for questions, but I'd like to get your feedback on that.
So I think one question, Brian, that I had was, we issued this as an RFI, which means that we can't go straight to selection. So I think that the purpose of these interviews would be to expedite the RFP process once we start that. So we would do the interviews now, go to RFP, and then not have to do a second round of interviews. Is that what you're thinking?
Potentially, unless somebody comes out of, unless you go to the RFP and somebody comes out of left field that you haven't had the chance to interview with this group, I wouldn't think that would be the case. I think this is likely to be the 4 that would be interested from an operating standpoint.
Okay. I mean, I think from my perspective, an hour each is probably more than enough, given the content.
Yeah.
That's probably all we can absorb.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to go any longer than that.
No.
Yeah.
So just to clarify there, the expectation is the presentation will be how they would market and operate this facility with minimal information on what they've done in the past? Or
I mean, that's up to you. I would say, you can ask them to present a summary of their entire proposal. Or if we want to, if we feel like it's a better use of time, we could say, why don't you just focus on your operating and marketing strategy and how you would work with us in terms of the options that we laid out in the RFI, and kind of dig in deeper on that, and then we can have plenty of time for Q&A at the end. Or you might say, we'll give you a longer time to present, and we'll ask you to present a full summary of your entire response. Those would be the two most typical ways to do it.
Yeah, I guess for me, hearing what they propose on this with follow-up questions on any information they give us in advance would be acceptable during the process.
Yeah, I mean, the intention that the AHTRFA had when we issued the RFI was to have this process inform the content of the RFP, because we weren't really sure what model we were asking to be bid on.
Okay.
And so
Right.
I think that'll be the focus of our interviews, is trying to come through all 4 of those interviews on the other side, having a good idea of what it is we're asking people to respond to.
Okay.
And that's my thought in suggesting that sort of focus to the interview, is focusing on what they, how they operate, their responses to the different operating models we put out there, and you having the chance to ask them lots of questions and think through that with each of them. Because I think, as you're saying, Drew, that would be the most beneficial in terms of deciding if you want to issue an RFP, and if so, what you want to write it.
Okay.
All right, so to be clear, we'll get a written document to review in advance, and then anything in that format that we think needs to be supplemented, we can supplement with our own questions. Then, assuming we go to an RFP, and the mix of responses is from this group of 4, we could either determine we already know one well enough that we go straight to negotiations, or if we liked 2 of however many, we could choose to interview
Again,
2 to make sure we got it right.
on the specifics of that proposal. Because it could be,
Correct.
I've not seen the proposals, but it could be that, we pick a particular operating model that wasn't their original submission,
But they're still willing to
but they're
submit.
still willing to do that, and so it could change the whole context.
Exactly. Yep. And we'll make sure that you all receive all 4 of the responses, and then the sort of summary sheet that my team's put together.
Do you all have a preference for hard copies or digital versions of those? I know everybody has their own preference when it comes to.
Well, I mean, you all shouldn't be burdened with that. I mean, what's
No.
going to happen when it makes it to me, if it's electronic, I'm going to have somebody.
Going to print it?
Yeah, just digital's fine.
Digital file.
Okay. All right. Brian, do you have any sense of what our timeline's going to be going forward? So you've got the interviews on the August 28th. What are you thinking in
Correct.
terms of an RFP and wrapping this process up?
Yeah, so I think after the interviews, it would be great just to talk with everyone on the board about, their takeaways and what they think the right next steps are. I mean, you don't have to issue an RFP. You can say, we've gone through this and we don't think we want to, or you can say, yes, we do, and this is what we think it should look like. I know from talking to Travis that RFP will require a little bit longer lead time than the RFI. And Travis can probably fill in more on that, but I believe that, if it's something that it can be contracted off of the selection, there has to be more time put into developing the sample contract, things like that.
Okay. Does anybody have any questions for Brian?
I was going to say the only thing that I was a little disappointed with is how, to be honest, weak the responses were on the marketing side. I know some folks who kind of focus on sports tourism marketing now, and I made sure they all got the RFP and none of them responded. And like I said, one group did add an option to do the marketing as part of, rather than just the operations, but that's something we can talk about more in the coming weeks. I think there could be some opportunities to still set up some conversations with people who just do the marketing piece, but maybe that's something that Victus can kind of do on our own.
Okay, so with that information, a question I would have would be, let's say we do the interviews and we decide that we want to issue the RFP that calls for operator and marketing. Do you think that these four firms would then team up with somebody and make a response that's more complete? Or do we lose?
So no, to clarify, what they said is the marketing is part of our operating services.
Oh,
so
okay.
if the other three. So if you hire us to operate, you'll also get our marketing.
I see.
But if you just want us to market, we're not interested in that.
I see. Okay.
Except for Kemper, who said, yeah, we can do the marketing. But honestly, their marketing only fee was almost it was about 67% of their full operating fee. So it was kind of, the way I read that is, yeah, we'll do it, but you're going to pay almost as much as you would for the whole thing.
Okay. All right. Any other questions for Brian?
No.
All right. Well, thanks, Brian.
Did you also want me to talk a little bit about
Naming rights.
naming?
Oh, yeah, that's the next item on the agenda. So we'll close this one out and move on to the next one.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
So the next item on the agenda is discussion and direction to staff concerning the issuance of a naming services RFP. Just to introduce this a little bit for the board members, I know we have talked about this lightly in conversations about financing the sports center, but as we get closer and closer to the comprehensive agreement phase, it seems like it's time to start talking about other sources of revenue. One of those opportunities might be offering naming rights for the facility. I personally have been contacted, some of you may have also, by firms that do this with interest in being engaged. And so in a similar vein as us issuing an RFI for operating processes, I thought maybe the time was right to engage a firm to go out and see what the possibilities might be, to see how we might reduce the cost of the facility for the localities. It's my understanding this would be a non-binding thing, so we basically cast a net. We hire a firm, we cast a net, we see what we get, and decide if that's something we want to pursue or not. So Brian, take it away.
Sure. So just to give you some context, this is from our own database of youth and amateur sports facilities that have current naming rights deals. So just to kind of give you a sense for what the market is out there. On average, the ones in our database are about $150,000 to $160,000 a year over an average term of about 10 years. So that's $1.6 million over 10 years. Corporate naming rights are typically paid annually over a fixed term. Sometimes it can be a life arrangement, but 10 years seems to be the most common now. Some of these smaller and shorter deals are a little bit older ones in our database. But the vast majority of the newer ones are, at least 5 to 10 year deals, ranging in the $100,000 to $200,000 range. And this is for overall facility naming rights. One of the things I would encourage, if you do decide you want to look at this type of opportunity, is that you also have something that's a notch below naming rights. We typically call those founding partnerships. So we might have an overall naming rights partner, and then you might have a handful of partners just below that at a slightly lower level that also have a very strong presence in the building and come on as founding level partners. So as Drew mentioned, my recommendation would be, if you want to pursue this, we can help you put out an RFP, send it to sales companies that specialize in sponsorship and naming rights advertising for for a facility like this. I would encourage you to focus this piece on the naming rights and founding partner level, your top 3 to 5 partners, because this is typically money that you as the authority would carve out to help support, the capital cost of building the facility. Anything below that, your smaller sponsors, advertisers, things like that. The rest of that sponsorship and advertising program is typically going to fall under the operator. So that's going to go towards the ongoing operations of the facility. Most of those are going to be year-to-year type deals. It's really only the naming rights and founding partners where you're going to have these long-term corporate partnerships that can be 5 to 10-year deals, and are large enough sums to help offset the capital costs of constructing the facility. One other thing I wanted to add, when you bring on a sales firm, if it's a qualified firm that has extensive experience selling in this space for naming rights, typically there's going to be 2 ways they're compensated. The first is most of them are going to require usually a 12 to 18 month term where they have exclusive rights to sell this, and most of them are going to have some sort of fixed monthly fee to cover their sales and marketing costs and provide a small amount of profit for that time. And then they'll also, on the back end, have a commission structure where they receive a percentage of the value of the deals they negotiate. Usually that's aligned with when the corporate partner pays, so they would get a percentage of that each year that you pay through to them, in addition to that sort of monthly retainer during the period. So there is a cost to their service, whether or not you ultimately accept the deals they bring to you. But if they bring a deal to you, you don't like the partner, it doesn't seem like the right fit, whatever that might be, you decide you don't want to accept that naming rights deal, you are not required to take it, and you don't have to pay a commission on a deal that you don't think is the right deal.
So I was going to ask a question of legal here. Let's say that we do issue an RFP, and the process of us issuing an RFP generates interest in the community, and we get an unsolicited proposal to name the building after a local company. What does that mean for the process? And then the second question would be, what if we've issued the RFP, hired a naming rights consultant, and then we get an unsolicited proposal?
Great question.
Well, let me speak to one issue that hadn't been raised, just because we have to think about that. I know we're going to fund this with bonds, preferably tax-exempt bonds, since that's part of what I do. One of the issues that you have with naming rights is it can influence whether it's treated as a private activity bond and makes the bond taxable versus tax-exempt.
Right.
So there's restrictions, and I can put together an explanation of the restrictions.
Right.
But it's important to kind of keep that in mind for any kind of sponsorship that's a continuing sponsorship type arrangement.
I see. Okay.
So back to did you have?
No, I was not just that. There. Can you hear me?
Uh-huh.
Yes. I just think it raises concerns generally about the public nature of this entity that I would like to, I can't tell you, oh, absolutely no, but I also think we need to make sure legally the ramifications.
Sure.
Is my concern.
Okay. Questions on this item?
So I
Oh,
guess,
we didn't get the answer to my question. The unsolicited proposals, what happens in those scenarios?
Depends on how you write the RFP.
Yeah, so you're thinking, see if I can understand exactly what it is. So you do an unsolicited, or you just get somebody in the community says they want to sponsor it.
Right.
and then you issue an RFP.
The Guernsey Tingle Regional Sports Center.
I would say no.
He gets excited leaves here and goes home and writes up a proposal to name it after his company.
Yeah, no, I like, there's a Seagull Center, so there should be a Seagull.
There you go.
Something, yeah.
The Sands Anderson Williamsburg Sports Center.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you don't, it's not like a BPA, you don't have to, they're just.
So we could consider that if it came in, okay.
Yeah, and then you can do the RFP.
And then just
after.
structure the RFP so that if that were to happen organically, the company doesn't get their standard 10% or whatever they would take of the deal.
Yeah,
They're going to want something, of course.
I mean, you just exclude that from whatever the deal.
If that were to happen,
Yeah,
okay.
It sounds like you're gonna have to pay a monthly fee or some term regardless. So for me, it'd be,
Yeah, that's part of what that monthly fee is. If they don't end up bringing an acceptable deal to you, or somebody goes directly to, a board member or something like that, they're still getting paid and have some profit built in during that period.
yeah, so, Mr. Chairman, make me feel a little more comfortable if we did a little more investigation on the financial. I mean, we collect $1 million a year for over 5, and how much does it cost us over that period in tax issues? I would be more comfortable waiting till we find that out, so before we would issue an RFP for it. And the second part of it is doing the RFP and finding out what, I'm sure there's a percentage, just like in real estate now, that we know we're going to have to give up right off the bat versus us trying, if we think that it's financially efficient for us to solicit and it doesn't have a negative tax impact, for us to try it on our own first before. I mean, there's a lot of folks in this room and community members that that we have contact with that, besides Guernsey Tingle, they would want to write that big check,
There's nobody bigger than Guernsey
interested.
Tingle.
So I would like to find out more about that and then go it on our own at first if we think it's a good idea.
I'll throw in another wrinkle as well, which is several of the operators who submitted also talked about how they would like to sell naming rights. So it's also something that you could potentially tie into that RFP.
So my comments are, I think we'd be criticized if we didn't pursue this, whatever we end up doing. In terms of the exact sequencing, I'm not sure if we need more information. I think a couple of things, John, doing it on our own has some issues because you run some vulnerability of, well, why did you take this one? And these other people didn't know about it. And if we had known, we would have done it. And if you go through some kind of process, you inoculate yourself from that. Anybody who contacts you, you can say, we're going through this process and we encourage you to make a submission, and you can't say you didn't give somebody an opportunity. So that's something to think about.
That's a good point.
I assume we wouldn't want to specify what we use the money for. That should be our prerogative. If we needed to be our operating reserve or something else, I mean, that should be ours to solve. And obviously there would be some legal things in this too, like defining what the right you were auctioning was and what other rights, subsidiary rights remain. I mean, are we going to have the Neil Morgan bathroom or the John Carnifax
Urinal?
coat room, whatever. All that would have to be somehow tiered and defined.
Yep.
But ultimately, I'm sure my board would, somebody's going to say, well, why didn't you try to get some naming rights and help defray some of the costs?
And I agree with everything you said, and, kind of on a much smaller scale, we have a whole sponsorship package and have received as much as $75,000 for sponsorship. So I think we just have to model and put it out there for everybody we give you 6 months or 3 months, and here's our package, and see what we get. So I agree, it's got to be transparent, open, and for anybody to at least have an opportunity to put in their proposal, so.
It looks like healthcare is where the action is.
That's right, that's exactly right. So the reason I put this on the agenda was because nearing the runway where we have to land this plane. And a major step is presenting a comprehensive plan, for lack of a better word, to the elected bodies, all three of them, and having them agree to a path forward. And I think, like Neil, that if we don't have an answer to this question, having looked at it, considered it, rejected it, or accepted it, that will be an open-ended question and we won't land the plane. And so I put it on the agenda because I think that there are a lot of questions to answer. I personally have never done this before, so I don't know what to expect from a proposal, and I'm curious to see what the arrangements are when people bid on it. And so my suggestion would be that we ask Travis to work on an RFP in concert with Sands Anderson's advice, and let's see what responses we get. That's non-binding, so even if we decided then we didn't want to pursue it, we don't have to. And like I say, I sort of wonder if just the little bit of publicity we might get about issuing this RFP doesn't stir some of our local healthcare institutions to come forward with a suggestion.
So Drew, there is one other type of RFP you could issue. Instead of putting out an RFP for the sales service provider, you could start with an RFP asking for proposals from companies interested in the naming rights. We see that fairly frequently. There's been a couple I've seen just in the last few months that have come out in different parts of the country. So you could do it that way, and if you don't get any acceptable proposals from that, you could then say, okay, well, maybe we should go out and hire a service provider or add it to our operator's agreement, however you want to do it, to have somebody actually go out and, shake the trees to try to find somebody interested in doing a naming rights deal. So you could just start off with not hiring a service provider, but making it known that you're open to proposals and doing that through a formal process.
So do you think, Brian, that we have enough information to do that? I mean, publicly,
So,
I would think they would want to know design and a little more concretely exactly what was being done.
I think they know, and they'd know enough at this point to know what type of facility is, the scale of it, the events. They're typically going to look at things like our feasibility study to see the type of events that'll be coming in, what the expected use is. We've worked with some different health systems that have sports medicine practices and sports training practices and things like that, and understand how they generate value from those. This is typically the stage at which you would start the process for that, so I don't think we're too early, no.
Okay.
And as part of our assisting you with that RFP, I would also propose to do a valuation of what we think it's worth and putting together some of those suggested tiers, which we could do, we could do that in about 3 or 4 weeks. So I would think that would be helpful as well to get a sense of what we think this should be worth, and what a naming rights versus a founding partner might mean in terms of the different assets that they get in exchange for that. So, I think that would be an important part of the process. So when you do start getting responses, you can evaluate them against what we think it should be worth.
Okay.
I guess, quick question on you talked about maybe affecting the bond, but to Mr. Morgan's point, if the money was used not for the capital expenses and money can be moved around from whichever, but if it was used for operating, then it wouldn't affect the bonding, or would it?
It probably would still affect the bonds,
Okay.
but I don't want to, put a damper on this. I mean, I think it's worth figuring this out, and we can make the decision once we see sort of what the values might be as to whether there's any, let's say, under general rule, if it's more than 5% of anywhere between 5 and 10%, there's different rules of whether of the cost of the facility or of the annual income you get. So there's 2 different tests. Then that's when it might affect the taxability of the interest on the bonds.
Okay.
We can make that decision later when we see what the numbers are and decide and ask and talk to our financial advisors and say, what's the difference if we issued taxable bonds versus tax exempt? Am I making up, is this really better? Because it
Is
could
that-
well be better.
Is that only if the revenue from the naming rights agreement is going directly to pay the debt service?
No, it's just the use, it's kind of it's the use of the facility, revenue from the use of the facility, and naming rights is considered, naming a facility is considered a use. So whether it's the operations income or the amount of the bonds, it's a,
So would it be the same if the management company had some sponsorship part of their package, if they collected that?
from the sponsorship?
Got laundered through the management company.
Yeah, because it's been very common in arenas and event centers and convention facilities that are
It's-
publicly owned.
It's a matter of the dollar amount. I mean, that's why I'm
No
saying.
matter how it gets into the system.
Huh.
Yeah, because if, let's say this is a $50 or $60 million facility, and you're only going to get $2 million from naming rights, or something like that.
And it has to be worth the return.
Then it's less than that 5-10% number.
That's right.
So then I'm
Okay.
not worried about it.
Yeah.
It's fine.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I would say, my thought is we proceed with one of these two options and trust that Dan, the tax master Siegel, is going to work this out.
I like that RFP. Second proposal.
Second one?
Yeah, I like that. That doesn't bind us.
So calling for proposals for naming
And
rights
we're
as
not
opposed to a
spending money
company.
up front that we may not need.
I can go along with that. I do think that shifts some of the burden to us in
To market it.
this thing, and none of us are specialists in that. So that it shifts, instead of a company that kind of knows all the ins and outs of that, you have to look for some help from our current stable of consultants to get it right.
Yes, I agree. So Brian, I think there's two questions embedded in that before we look for a motion on this, would be, can you help Travis craft an RFP that does this? And secondly, is Victus in a position to make sure that we're putting that RFP opportunity in front of the right people?
I think so. Yeah, I can write you up. I can write you up a proposal that outlines exactly what we can do.
Okay. Somebody want to make a motion?
I move that the board authorize our consultant team to prepare and, subject to review, issue an RFP soliciting directly to appropriate firms the opportunity for naming rights, details to be defined by the team, so that we can develop that information and factor it into our financing plans.
I'll second.
Ms. Hutton?
Aye.
Mr. Morgan?
Aye.
Chair Trivette?
Aye.
Mr. Fuller?
Aye.
Mr. Carnifex?
Aye.
All right, excellent. That brings us on to closed session. I think there's a motion.
I move that the Board of the Historic Triangle Recreation Facility Authority convene in closed meeting pursuant to Section 2.2-3711A6 of the Code of Virginia 1950 as amended, for the purpose of discussion or consideration of investment of public funds where competition or bargaining is involved, where, if made public initially, the financial interest of the authority would be adversely affected, design, update, and consideration of facilities, construction, management services, and operating model options, and information gathered for authority for inclusion in proposed RFP.
I'll second.
And thank you for not asking me to read that.
Ms. Hutton?
Aye.
Mr. Morgan?
Aye.
Chair Trivette?
Aye.
Mr. Fuller?
Aye.
Mr. Carnifex?
Aye.
The board will adjourn to closed session.
Reconvene in open meeting.
Second.
Ms. Hutton?
Aye.
Mr. Morgan?
Aye.
Chair Trivette?
Aye.
Mr. Fuller?
Aye.
Mr. Carnifex?
Aye.
Oh, certification.
Motion to certify. I hereby move that each member certify that, to the best of their knowledge, only public business matters lawfully exempted from open meeting requirements by Virginia law were discussed in closed meeting, and only such public business matters as were identified in the motion convening the closed meeting were heard, discussed, or considered by the board.
Second.
Ms. Hutton?
Aye.
Mr. Morgan?
Aye.
Chair Trivette?
Aye.
Mr. Fuller?
Aye.
Mr. Carnifax?
Aye.
That concludes our business for the day. Is there a motion to adjourn?
So move. I can do that one.
Second.
Ms. Hutton?
Aye.
Mr. Morgan?
Aye.
Chair Trivette?
Aye.
Mr. Fuller?
Aye.
Mr. Carnifax?
Aye.
All right, thanks, everybody. We are adjourned.